So it's time for another demo. Today I wanted to touch on gouache as a medium all on its own. So you've seen me use it one or two times, especially I talk about using white gouache. But today we're going to do an entirely gouache painting on this wood panel. Some things you have to remember when you're working with gouache is it's a lot more opaque than the watercolor that you're used to working with. It has a little bit of a chalky substance, which is what gives it its opacity and also kind of a thicker paint quality. Your dark colors are going to go down really dark and then they're going to dry a little lighter, which is similar to watercolor. But the thing that's different is your lighter colors are actually going to dry darker. So when you're mixing white into things or mixing over, you're often going to end up with a less pale version than you thought. It's going to kind of dry down and dry up, so they tend to sort of meet in the middle. So it's still going to require several passes to create that balance in your contrasting layers. Something that can be very exciting, though, is that you don't have to be as well planned or as cautious when laying down gouache layers. The opacity does allow you to sort of rework areas, but they do reactivate the stuff that's underneath them. So I'm working on wood panel. It's going to behave a little different than paper, but only because it sort of sucks the water down into it quicker. It dries both. It doesn't hold standing water, but it stays a little damp longer. So as you can see, it's a little stronger, a little punchier as I'm laying down these colors than it would be if I were working in watercolor. I am mixing some watercolor colors in there. I do not have a yellow in my gouache, and I am using this like pink that you've seen me use, that pink lake, purple lake color that is often in some of my shadows. Those are both watercolors. So you can mix your gouache and your watercolors interchangeably in a lot of ways. Just know that the watercolor is never going to be as punchy as the gouache, and it won't go over gouache as well as gouache goes over watercolor. A lot of people like to use gouache for illustrations, things like that. They have a very graphic quality, and you can get some beautiful light effects and stuff with them, just like you can with watercolors. If you water them way down, they behave incredibly similarly. They're just going to be a little more opaque. They're going to obliterate the layers underneath them a little more. So you can see I'm sort of very roughly blocking in warm light and cool shadows, sort of making up the colors I'm going to use in this as I go, going off reference image, but obviously that rabbit looks like a rabbit. So this is my Technicolor interpretation of it. But like, I know that I want these leaves, they're going to end up lighter. I'm going to want to do veining on them. I'm going to want them more yellow. But with gouache, I can go ahead and just sort of block them in this darker green and not worry that I'm not going to be able to pull that back out later. With gouache, I do find it still needs lots of layers to make it feel rounded and soft in the same way that watercolors do, but you're filling in the whole area often more than leaving negative space to go back over. So you can see how quickly the yellow affects that layer underneath it, mixes on the page. The gouache is sort of reactivating, it's blending nicely, it still settles out. Gouache is known for having a very like velvety, very matte finish, which is one of the reasons I like to use it for these wood paintings. And because I don't have to plan as much. I mean, I'm going in with super poppy colors and super kind of crazy stuff and knowing that I can find balance in it later. So reds and yellows and all sorts of things, and they kind of just mix together. And then if I need to walk them back, I can always do that after the fact. Now we're going to start finding our mid-tones a little bit more and also creating a darker shadow, because that purple really is not selling it for me. So I have sort of a navy blue gouache that I'm using in thin layers to create soft shadows in texture, and then I'll use it very opaquely in a couple areas with more saturation. use a mix of brands of gouache. I use a lot of the Holbein's designer gouache. For years, those were the only set I had, was their like primary set. And you can mix pretty much everything you ever need from that set. I've gotten a couple others of colors I know that I just use regularly. I'm trying to find a good mid-tone color to marry out of those purple and blue shadows and get these yellows with, I didn't like the green as much. So warming them up with this sort of pinkish red. But you can see even the paler colors like this orange and this red and gouache really kind of help blend edges, soften edges. That dark shadow, if I don't like it, I can go back over it like I did in the face there and really kind of tone it down in a way that would be near impossible to do in watercolor. You can still see that if areas get super wet and I touch my brush full of pigment to it, I still get that bloom and diffused effect that we get in watercolor. They move incredibly similarly. I find them a little less grainy because they have that opacity to sort of hide the grain that we see sometimes when we're mixing really wet washes. But they dry at the same speed pretty much. I find occasionally they dry a little faster than watercolors. So adding the white layer to gouache is what often really changes everything, at least in how I use it. So I've waited on it to dry, and now I'm going through and doing the white layer with gouache. And it will look incredibly starkly white as I start to lay it down, and then remember that your light colors dry darker. So when I'm using a pretty watered down white like I am right now, it's drying down, it's reactivating the layers underneath it and sort of marrying them, flattening them. So you can still see the tones, it's just mixing with the white and showing through and creating highlights and texture. I really like using this for fur, obviously. But it will take me several passes with the white in any areas that I really want it to be white. Like I'm laying it down pretty heavy on that chest part right there, but it's still gonna keep kind of drying darker, until at some point I will have built up enough of it that it will settle into the tone that I want. You can also use your white to kind of pull out your colors or change a tone. So I'm going to use it to sculpt these berries, but then also that berry that's just behind the one I'm painting. I've decided I wanted a little purplier. I want a touch of red, like that one hasn't entirely ripened. So I'm going to color the whole thing with white, tone it down, and then add the reds in on top of it. Wait on it to dry, and I'll do that again because it just keeps drying darker. For the leaves, there's a few areas I want to be more yellow, more weathered, more yellow, more warm. So going in and coating whole areas of the leaf that I want to be more yellow, but also doing the veining and the highlights on it. And then I can coat this white once it's dried with a thin layer of watercolor yellow, and it'll tint all the white gouache. So if you're working with a lighter color and you need it to go over it, and you don't have that color in gouache, or you like the transparency of watercolor like I do, I just can't think of any Nerd Body yellow gouache. I always want my yellows a little more warmed up and transparent. But you can see that the yellow kind of is attracted to the white gouache. It coats it in a way that it doesn't like fight as much with the other colors because it's not gouache. So that sort of glazing technique is something I use often, defining areas with white, pulling colors out, and then sort of glazing over them with a pale watercolor color. So there's that berry. It's a very different color than it was now. It's got kind of a purpley cast. It's got some texture. So we're gonna work on the background of this. One thing that can be kind of hard is getting gouache, especially if you're doing large flat areas of very dark color. It looks so dark when you put it down and it all looks even. And then as it dries, you'll see that it has different kind of choppy areas or areas that you had more water. This is multiplied when doing it on wood because the wood sort of pulls the water into it. So I did this little close-up, so I'm hoping you can see sort of some of the choppiness that I'm talking about. It just means you're gonna have to go over that area, like let it dry and go back over it a couple times to get a truly dark area without any of the brush marks in it. And to get to be the color that you really want it to be, this one dried out on me to like a pale, beautiful purple several times, but had a lot of texture that I wasn't aiming for. So I probably did about 3 passes on this background. Just, you know, and the first pass is really heavy. There's a lot of pigment, very saturated. The ones after that, sometimes I use less, and it's just sort of moving the pigment around and trying to find equilibrium amongst all of it so you don't have any of these little patches. So giving you kind of a look at it, this is after like a pass and a half. That bottom section, I wanted you to be able to see where that part is still dry. You can see when I get water on it, reactivate it, it goes very dark again, but it's drying up to this much more lovely color that goes with our color palette a little better. So I'm gonna keep going over it. I'll probably do 2 more passes, but that is the beginning steps of gouache.